Hey guys, Youngblood with you, and today I wanted to talk to you about what could be coming next in the Salvage world. 3.18 brought us our first iteration of Salvage, with ships like the Vulture and the Reclaimer beginning to have the ability to really simply strip the hulls of a ship for scrap. Now, that's an important step, but it is admittedly a Tier 0 implementation, which is put out there as an initial step to allow for testing of gameplay and impacts on the economy before developing and releasing additional features. Think about mining, for example, where when we first started with cracking and extracting simple materials, but then in future iterations we got Quantanium and other unstable resources that made breaking a little bit more challenging, and then you had the effect that you needed to get to a certain location to offload the material before it exploded, you couldn't take damage, and those are all additional things. Then we got ground mining vehicles, and following that were additional utilities that changed how you found, mined, and stabilized the breaking process, including tools that you could use. But I'm not really intending just to talk about Tier 0 hull stripping today, as the intention is really to talk more about what could be coming in the future of this gameplay loop. Some of this has been confirmed, but some of this is likely a little bit more intuition coming in, and it is important to mention that there aren't really timelines on any of these coming into the game, and even if they were on the roadmap, that schedule changes frequently, so it's hard to stick to it. Remember that more foundational items like server meshing and new systems like Pyro coming into the game are where the attention and focus are right now. Now, I have questions about where we are starting with this really stripping hulls and how that's going to change over time. My first question is how does this gameplay become more skill-based? In the mining game loop, you're forced to keep your laser in the green zone to break the rock, with more valuable resources being more challenging to balance. So how does something like that apply to hull stripping? Now, you can see in the current iteration that there are percentages that represent how much material is where you're focused with your lasers, so you could make good decisions about your extraction rate. But that's even pretty simple comparatively. I almost wonder if we're going to see different types of hulls, like armor versus actual interior hull wall, being more or less challenging to manage. Maybe the armor materials are a different alloy that sells for a different price, so it's not just generic scrap, but it takes you longer to get that off of the ship. If the goal is to manage the return on your time, CIG can either make it harder or take more time to complete to balance things out. Even then, I'd still like skill over a time sink, so I'd prefer that direction. We also know that we have two different types of salvage modules on these ships. The more precise, which is kind of like a laser beam, and the more widespread module, which I think is called the abrade. And where we have it today, the wider range abrade module makes way more sense. But if you had to use a more precise cutter to be able to then extract with the abrade after getting to the more valuable stuff, that could be an entirely different skill and decision-making process. Those topics are more focused on how hull stripping can involve, but I think there's actually more interesting new gameplay that will be coming that's going to be important to be aware of. First on that list for me is component stripping, or how you can take more valuable pieces of a ship with you. So instead of just taking the hull scrap, now you're taking weapons or thrusters or those types of items. I already mentioned the more precise module that is already on the Vulture and the Reclaimer, but I think what you'll have to do is use the more powerful precise beam to cut these out of the ship, which will probably take a steady hand, I would imagine, to ensure that you're not actually doing damage to the component, because no one's going to want to buy a non-working component from you. What will involve is cutting the component out, and then it will be a ship like a Reclaimer possibly using the large claw to grab that piece and pull it back into the ship. Or maybe in a smaller ship, you end up having to use a tractor beam or a little snub craft to transport to some storage area, either on your ship or another storage vessel. It's also important to remember that the size of weapons on ships are massive, much bigger than the character. So there are probably going to be some limitations on how you actually get the job done there. The Reclaimer also has drones, so the question should be asked, what all can those drones actually do? Are they able to carry things that you cut off back to the ship? Can they conduct hull scraping of your target? Or are they more focused on precision cuts, being able to get closer, safer, in maybe a hazardous debris field? Do they have the ability to be automated when you upgrade your ship's computer with blades, or do they always have the expectation of being under manual control? Additionally, in the component stealing space, you also have the handheld oxy cutter on the multi-tool, which I think could be relevant for cutting pieces of ships, with that cutter, or maybe even cutting the hull open, breaching into airlocks, and potentially it may be a requirement for severing component connections inside of these ship's engineering sections. For example, maybe you're able to get into a derelict and you make it into the ship component area, but if the power's out, you may need the tool to cut that compartment open or even just break that component free before you then use a tractor beam to pull it out and move it back to your ship. That's not confirmed gameplay, but I think it's logical seeing the size of some of these components. Now, one key differentiator between the ships we have in right now, the Reclaimer and the Vulture, aside from the massive size and crew difference, is the chopping area interior on the ship of the Reclaimer. You have a large processing area with spinning cutting blades that appears to be for taking large materials and chopping them into smaller ones. But the question that gets begged is, why is this here if the current gameplay lets you hull scrape using more advanced technology? I can't imagine that the goal is to allow you to chop up components, as they would be significantly more valuable in working order. So what's the point of this section of the ship? Are hull materials that you cut off in large sections and get brought into your ship via the claw to be chopped up and processed on board somehow more pure and valuable? That might make sense. Is this to destroy non-working components that can't be scraped via the lasers? I don't really know, but there needs to be a purpose to justify this design on the ship and the space that it takes up on the ship too. The ship is gigantic, so it needs to be big and validated for some reason. I also think that the introduction of Titan suits will mean that there are other applications than combat. A Titan suit with a cutting blade and a claw could be a very useful option for doing salvage, on a multi-purpose ship versus using a dedicated salvage ship. And would also provide to probably be significantly more efficient than using hand tools and tractor beaming away if this somehow becomes a more powerful option. We've also seen concept art for a little scrap or salvage crafts that can be used with cutting tools on board. So how those relate to this overall gameplay loop is a little bit unknown, but it is interesting knowing that it'll all have an impact at some point. I think ultimately what we know is that we don't really know what's coming next. I feel pretty confidently that a more skill-based version of hull stripping is probably what's next, but how that gets implemented is probably to be determined. Beyond that, I think everything I've discussed here is in the scope of the game, though not anywhere near on the roadmap as far as time frame's concerned. But it should be considered as you're evaluating your fleet and how you do things, because it will have an impact on how you spend your time and how you can maximize the all-important UEC per minute calculation that I use that ultimately determines how profitable any activity truly is. So that's pretty much for this video. If you guys have options or ideas on what could be coming next other than what I already talked about, I'd love to hear about them. Aside from that, I appreciate you all watching. Stay tuned for more coming soon. Have yourselves a wonderful day and take care.